Now, as we get into Zechariah chapter 9, it's important to know that most scholars treat Zechariah 9 through 11 as a unit, and even Zechariah 9 through 14 as even a greater unit. But this oracle that you see here in verse 1 is believed to continue into chapter 10 and into chapter 11. Now, just for context, we're still Zechariah with the exiles that have returned from Babylon, now dwelling in Judah and rebuilding the temple. At this point, the second temple should have been rebuilt. It's believed that the construction of that temple was complete, and Zechariah was really describing prophecies a lot more closely related to the end of the age. And so I'll try to guide you through that as we go. But it starts out in Zechariah chapter 9 with an oracle against the land, several lands, but these are lands that have had opposition to God's covenant with Israel in one way or another. These aren't all lands necessarily that are outside the promised borders of Israel, but some of them are. But anyway, the idea is for any peoples or collections of people who have opposed God's purposes for Israel, God's going to correct that opposition, and that opposition is going to result in unity and restoration in the Messianic age once that opposition has been dealt with. And Zechariah is going to get into what dealing with that opposition truly looks like in these chapters. We see some of the most graphic depictions of what many consider the bowls of wrath or Messianic plagues that are associated with the end of the age and the day of the Lord's vengeance that are in these chapters. So remarkable. But anyway, let's just get through some of these. We've got Damascus. Oh, it says the Lord has his eye on mankind. And ultimately, the Lord is going to communicate that no opposition to God's covenant with Israel goes unnoticed. And God will actually use his discipline of these adversarial nations to draw attention to himself, to actually draw attention to his supremacy and that he is who he says he is. And so the Lord has his eyes on all of mankind, but then you look down here and it says other parts of the world are going to notice the Lord's discipline. So the Lord brings his discipline upon these lands that are to the north. I don't even know particularly how to pronounce all of them, but you've got Hadrach, which is outside the borders to the north of Israel, would have been considered territory of the old Assyrian Empire. But this northern area that's sort of symbolic of just the kingdoms to the north, kind of similar to how Ezekiel talked about Magog in Ezekiel 38 and 39. But even further south, it just kind of works its way south to Damascus and Tyre and Sidon. And the Lord is going to release judgment against them. And that judgment is going to draw the attention of other adversaries, like those who would be in Philistia. Now, just specifically with verses 3 and 4 and this whole kind of destruction of Tyre. Now, Tyre had resisted or repelled the aggression of Assyria and Babylon. Tyre had endured both of those. But Alexander the Great eventually came along and truly did conquer Tyre and destroy its former glory. So there is a historical example of this, but again, these are foreshadowings, representations that were meant to foreshadow really what's going to be fulfilled in a total way at the end of the age, which we're going to get into as we continue to read. Really, the more we read, the clearer it gets. So I'm going to move down to verse 5. Ascalon and Gaza and Ekron, and these are kind of the major cities inside of Philistia, what would be considered modern-day Gaza. In Zechariah's day, Gaza was just a city. But today, Gaza represents what would be kind of ancient Philistia. But anyway, they see this discipline and they become afraid. God is disciplining these nations. And there's fear that comes into them. And essentially, that discipline comes into Gaza. It says, the king shall perish. Now, it's the leaders of ancient Philistia, but it's the leaders of modern-day Gaza, those who have positioned themselves in opposition to God's covenant with Israel. God will cut them off. It says they will perish. And a mixed people will dwell in Ashdod. Essentially, their pride is going to be cut off. Their idolatry is going to be cut off. They're going to be humbled, and they're going to be made subject to the borders and the authority of Israel in the Messianic age. literally, that area of Gaza, modern day Gaza, will become a remnant for our God. And it will be like a clan of Judah. It will come into the proper borders of Israel and will be governed directly by Israel authority in the Messianic age. And then I will encamp, and this is now a description closer to the Messianic age, where God encamps in his house in Jerusalem as a guard, so that none can march to and fro. No oppressor shall march over them. For now I see with my own eyes. There's this promised protection. There's a couple of cross references in the notes that I might mention just really quick. Zephaniah chapter 2 also talks about ancient Philistia, or modern Gaza, that it will be deserted. It will become a desolation. There's going to be judgment against it, and there's going to be mourning. It says, the word of the Lord is against you, land of the Philistines, and I will destroy you until no inhabitant is left. Now, that's a pretty brutal destruction. You might be able to interpret that, especially with this here, that there are survivors, but those survivors are become loyal to God's covenant with Israel. But any who would oppose are the ones who would be, no inhabitant who are in opposition to God's covenant are left. And you, O sea coast, meaning that land of Philistia, will become the possession of the remnant of the house of Judah, on which they will graze, and they will dwell in the houses of Ashkelon. For the Lord, their God, will be mindful of them and restore their fortunes, referring to the remnant of Judah. And same thing here. It ends the same way in Zechariah 9. Then I will encamp at my house, and I will guard them. And there's this promise of peace. There's peace. No more will there be any, foreign forces that will threaten the borders of Israel. It's a promise of protection and the persistence of Israel's borders as have been promised to them. Zechariah 2, he even says, we looked at this last week, that God promises to be a wall of fire around their midst. He personally is going to ensure their borders. All right, let's move on to verses 9 and onward. Zechariah calls for celebration as Israel's Messiah appears to defeat all these oppositional forces and permanently restore Israel for the Messianic age. So there's rejoice, rejoice, O daughter of Zion, O daughter of Jerusalem. Behold, your king, that Messianic king, that Davidic Messiah is coming to you. Righteous and having salvation is he, humbled and lowly on a donkey. Now this is fascinating because most scholars agree Zechariah is foreshadowing the Messiah's first and second appearances side by side. So like Isaiah, Zechariah describes the Messiah's first appearance as lowly and humble. Not necessarily that the donkey is the humble part, because I don't know, you don't want to, disparage the actual utility and usefulness of a donkey, but it does say humble, that the Messiah will appear humble. And Isaiah 53 definitely preceded this prophecy in a major way. I'll just quote verses 2 and 3 that are included in the notes. Speaking of the Messiah, Isaiah says, he, the Messiah, grew up before you like a young plant, like a root out of dry ground. He had no form or majesty that we would look at him, or beauty that we would desire him. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief, as one from whom men hide their faces. He was despised, and we esteemed him not. And obviously in Matthew 21 depicts Jesus riding into Jerusalem on a donkey. And there's a quote in Matthew 21 referring to Zechariah 9 to establish the correlation of these two prophecies, meaning that this humble appearing of the Messiah relates to his first coming, but he also has a second appearing where the rest of this prophecy will be completely fulfilled. He says, I will cut off the chariot from Ephraim and the war horse from Jerusalem. Essentially, all of their military might is going to be, and any need for military force at all, any weapons at all, is going to be removed because there's going to be this promise of peace. The Messiah will speak peace. Literally, he will speak shalom to the nations. And this is a massive promise that we desire now, even today, in such great need. Because right now the nations are not at peace or at shalom, and there's a massive effort even that we would somehow come to that conclusion, would come to world peace. I mean, how often do you hear prayers for world peace? But here it is, a promise of the day when it will be fulfilled. He will speak peace, Shalom to the nations. And his rule shall be from sea to sea, from the river to the ends of the earth. And there are groups that are, of course, opposing God's covenant purposes for Israel who have sayings like from the river to the sea, meaning from the Jordan River or from the wherever river. In this verse, specifically, he's talking about the river of the Euphrates, from the river of the Euphrates to the ends of the earth, which is kind of like from the beginning to the end, from every corner, is going to be this reign of the Messiah and the peace that he's going to speak over the nations. As for you also, because of the blood of my covenant with you, I will set your prisoners free from the waterless pit. Return to your stronghold, O prisoners of hope. That title, prisoners of hope. Today I declare I will restore you double. And so even specifically for those who have been taken captive by the Antichrist forces in that final tribulation, that discipline period, there's liberation for them. He's going to set their prisoners free. And more than that, he's going to strengthen them. Because look what he says in verse 13. I have bent Judah as my bow and Ephraim as my arrow. Now these are formerly, recently liberated captives who are now being strengthened to become this tool of might in the Messiah's hand. And he says, I'm going to wield your sons, O Zion, against the sons of Greece. And whatever the significance is of the reference to Greece is not totally certain. Scholars kind of scratch their heads at it. But you could see the sons of Zion versus the sons of Greece representing the sons of God against the sons of what represent the sons of kind of wickedness or opposition or the Antichrist even, and wield you like a warrior's sword. So at this point, once the Messiah has completed his procession toward Jerusalem, accompanied by the captives that he's recently liberated, the Messiah and his army will defeat the Antichrist coalition force and secure Israel's restoration. Now, as we look specifically at verses 14 and 15, most commentators have treated Zechariah's depiction of the Lord's appearance, the Lord will appear over them, maybe as some kind of symbolic or unknowable detail, like in some way God's going to manifest his presence. But in terms of what Zechariah would have understood, it's pretty vague, and maybe that's true. But Psalm 48 also describes a parallel event. It's a parallel description in which the adversarial coalition is astounded also by the appearance of the Lord in a certain dramatic fashion above their heads. And it literally is the appearance of the heavenly city. As they are assembling to destroy Jerusalem, the heavenly Jerusalem appears overhead as a representation of the appearance of the Lord, kind of parallel to this, and it drives the enemy forces into panic. They're terrified and astounded. Psalm 48 goes into detail about it. I just have one verse to quote here for you out of the notes. It says, "For behold, the kings have assembled, they came together, but as soon as they saw it," referring to the city, "they were astounded. They were in panic and they took to flight." There's all kinds of descriptions that go on from there. But essentially, it's beginning to verse 15, the Messiah and his army will destroy those assembled adversarial armies. Psalm 45 says, "Your arrows are sharp in the heart of the king's enemies, and peoples will fall under you." Habakkuk chapter 3, verse 12 and onward, quite a few verses there, talk about the Lord marching through the earth in his fury and threshing the nations in his anger. He says, "You went out for the salvation of your people. For the salvation of your anointed, you crushed the head of the house of the wicked, laying him bare from thigh to neck." And goes on to talk about arrows and warriors and destruction and, victory, ultimately. Zephaniah chapter 1, same similar thing. I've got this in the notes as well. A day of a trumpet blast and battle cry against the fortified cities and against the lofty battlements. And Isaiah 41 goes on to describe basically the reversal of the circumstances where the Antichrist forces appear mighty and Israel's forces, of course, they have none. They're all taken captive. They're fleeing, and Israel is in the weakest state it's ever been. But instead, those circumstances are reversed, and the Antichrist forces are humbled and made weak, and the Messiah's forces, these freed captives, Israel's forces, are made mighty and strong. And here's what Zechariah sees. The Lord of hosts will protect them, the Messiah's army. They shall devour and tread down. All these adversaries, essentially, they're going to be basically covered in the remains of their adversaries in victory, standing in victory over them. And on that day, the Lord their God will save them. as the flock of his people. For like the jewels of a crown, the Jewish survivors at the beginning of the Messianic age, they will shine on the land of Israel like jewels in a crown. It's such a beautiful description. Ezekiel 34 said, I myself will shepherd my sheep, and I will make them lie down, declares the Lord. And Isaiah 60 says, arise and shine, for your light has come. Even though darkness covers the earth and darkness on the peoples, the Lord's glory will be seen on you, speaking to the remnant of Israel that remain in that day. And so here it is again. God will save them. They will be the flock. They will be his flock. And for like jewels of a crown, I just love the imagery of that. They're shimmering jewels set in fine jewelry, meaning they're reflecting the glory of God's presence all across the land. I think it's so, so beautiful. For how great is his goodness and how great is his beauty. And essentially, covenant blessings come into effect. There's going to be prosperity that leads to the population flourishing. Let's move on to Zechariah 10.